So I am delighted and honored to be with you here today to talk about employment's role in enabling, or in some cases, constraining marriage in the Middle East and North Africa. And this is work I have done with Dr. Agi Assad. So we already mentioned some of this important context in terms of marriage and work in MENA. Marriage is really the sole socially acceptable route to most important adult roles, including independent living, sexual relations, and childbearing. And the Islamic marriage contract provides for really asymmetric bargaining rights within marriage. And so the greatest bargaining power women and their families have is up front. So they attempt to secure optimal living conditions up front before the marriage in order to really secure the conditions they want within the marriage. And that raises the cost of marriage. This, of course, ties to the labor market in particular, with men needing to save for marriage, and it's very challenging in this context where youth unemployment is very high and informal employment is very widespread. So the ability to acquire good jobs that facilitate the transition to marriage is a challenge in the region. And in particular, one of the reasons youth unemployment is particularly high in the region may be this strategic queuing behavior, where young people will wait in the state of unemployment in order to try to obtain public sector or even scarcer formal private sector jobs. And we'll see that these marriage market and labor market aspects may actually be linked. That's one of the important aspects of this paper. Forward, backward. All right, so Raghi already mentioned this idea of the life course, and in particular the interdependence of life course transitions, so these links, and that the transition to marriage is contingent upon success in the labor market, particularly for men, because men and their families bear most of the marriage costs in the region, and also they have to signal their economic readiness for marriage and accumulate the savings to cover the costs of marriage. Now, for women, there's a somewhat different story. Work prior to marriage may help them accumulate savings towards their share of the marriage costs and their family's share of the marriage costs. But work prior to marriage may also pose reputational risks, particularly work in private sector or informal jobs where women may be exposed to harassment and reputational risks through that and other avenues. So when we think about the role of work and how this aspect of work links to transition to marriage, the previous work on this has been done by ERF, looking at Egypt and Iran, and looking at how a job or a good job may enable the transition to marriage for men. And here a good job is typically a formal job. And although this relationship has found that good jobs and employment help speed marriage, and this is linked, of course, to the fact that it's difficult to get these good jobs, there's concern that those who get good jobs may be a select group. There's a concern about endogeneity, we call it, in econometrics, that the people who get good jobs may be different in ways that are hard to observe. They may be of higher socioeconomic status and have higher aspirations for what their marriage will be like, which will complicate the relationship between work and marriage. Or, in the case of women, it may be that actually they leave work at marriage, so there's a reverse causality going on where it's in fact not work determining marriage, but marriage determining work. There's also the question of why does work matter? What is it about work that matters? So we can think about policies to enable this transition. We have to understand, is it the wage that matters? Is it the ability to save that matters? Is it the prestige of a job that matters? So to think about those key questions is in fact the focus of this presentation. We look at how different labor market statuses, so various types of employment as well as unemployment or being out of the labor force, affect the timing and probability of marriage for men and women. And in particular, we also look at how much of the effect of employment is coming through non-pecuniary aspects of jobs, those non-financial and prestige aspects of jobs, versus earnings and ability to accumulate savings, as these different mechanisms really are going to require different policy interventions. And we also look at whether selection into different types of employment is related to marriage timing to try to disentangle whether we can identify a cause and effect relationship. And lastly, one of the things this paper looks at, linking a very important question in the labor market to the marriage market, is whether or not remaining unemployed for queuing or searching for a formal job might actually pay off as a strategy for accelerating marriage. So if you're unemployed, it may delay marriage, but if your unemployment allows you to search for a better job, that better job may speed up your marriage, and there's a real trade-off we'll see there. So the data we use are from 3 comparable surveys carried out by ERF and the relevant national statistics offices in each country, We have data from Egypt from 2012, we have Jordan from 2010, and Tunisia from 2014, and these are the ERF labor market panel surveys. I really want to highlight here the importance of the very high quality of data that ERF has collected to being able to even research this question. The data has detailed labor market histories and information on what everyone is doing in each and every year, which you do not typically find in surveys. And that allows us to look at how what you're doing in a particular year can affect the timing of your marriage. We also have the advantage, in the case only of Egypt so far, of having panel data, so previous rounds in 1998 and 2006. And we can use these to get at past employment characteristics that aren't in the labor market histories, such as wages. So we can look at things like how wages affect whether you can subsequently get married. If you earn more, does it speed up your marriage, and by how much? So these are things we can only get at because of this excellent data. In terms of how we study this relationship, the outcome of interest we're looking at is age at marriage, and we model in terms of what's called a hazard, which is the probability of getting married at a particular age if you haven't gotten married yet. And we address this issue of selection, or for women especially, the potential reverse causality in the relationship between employment and marriage with an instrumental variables approach, where we use information on the local availability of public sector employment to predict whether individuals get public sector jobs and see how that affects the timing of marriage. We can only do this for the public sector because the public sector is centrally determined and other types of employment are not. So in terms of some of the things we look at that might affect marriage timing, we're really interested in how labor market status, which changes over time, it varies over time. Individuals are unemployed and then they get a job, or they may change the type of work, they may get a formal job, they may get a public sector job, how that affects their marriage timing. And we separate between the public sector, private formal wage work, where formal is you have a contract or you have social insurance, as distinct from private informal wage work, where you have neither contract nor social insurance. And then we talk about non-wage work, which is where you're an employer or self-employed, as well as being unemployed or out of the labor force, and how all those different statuses affect your transition into marriage. And we control for a host of other characteristics of individuals' background, like their education, their parents' socioeconomic status, brothers and sisters, other aspects of their background that are going to affect when they get married, as well as time trends. So in terms of the results we see, Raghi was alluding to these rising ages at marriage in the region. And so here in this graph, we are looking at the median age at marriage by birth cohort, so year of birth here. And we're looking at this for men, which are the solid lines, and women, which are the dashed lines. And we see particularly, for instance, in Tunisia, rising ages at marriage. Median age at marriage rose substantially for both men and women in Tunisia. In Egypt, though, the age at marriage, particularly for men, rose and then fell. For women, it was flatter. And in Jordan, we see a relatively flat profile in terms of the median age at marriage. So there are some different patterns we see in these different countries, some of which is related to labor markets, some of which is related to other markets as well. So what do we find in terms of how these marriage transitions relate to employment? So I'm going to distinguish all of my results separately between men and women because there are very different relationships we see. And for men, I'm going to talk about how other status is compared to private informal wage work, because private informal wage work is relatively readily available in the region. But some people are fortunate enough to achieve other labor market statuses, such as public sector work, and public sector work does speed up marriage, and that's true in all three of the countries we're examining. Private formal wage work speeds up marriage, but less so than public, and it only speeds up marriage compared to informal work in the case of Egypt. Non-wage work is no different than private informal wage work, so being an employer or self-employed doesn't help you in the marriage market at all compared to being a private informal wage worker. Whereas, unsurprisingly, being unemployed or being out of the labor force delays marriage for men. So they haven't gotten a job yet, they are delayed in their ability to get married. In contrast, for women, I'm going to compare the results to the alternative being out of the labor force, which is sort of the fallback position for women. And there we see, as with men, that the public sector work speeds up marriage in all three of the countries we examine, but that private sector, formal or informal work, is associated with delayed marriage. This is likely reverse causality, as we will see in a moment, that Irene will present how women leave work when they get married, particularly in the private sector, What's interesting is that when we look at having a private sector job now versus having a private sector job in the past, a private sector job in the past speeds up marriage, whereas having it now delays marriage, because some of those strategies around, for instance, savings are working in a job for a certain amount of time and then leaving it. Now, when we account for endogeneity, which is this issue of selection or reverse causality, that actually shows that there's an even bigger effect of good work, public sector work, on accelerating marriage. So work is even more important than we had previously thought, particularly good work in the public sector is even more important than we had thought for making this transition to marriage. And this, of course, this public sector work is decreasingly available in the region. In terms of why employment statuses matter, we can tease apart some of these different effects. And for men, public sector jobs have a benefit that's beyond formal private sector jobs. So it isn't just the job security, it isn't just the contract or social insurance that pays off, it's perhaps the prestige of a public sector job. It's not driven by wage differences, because when we put wages in prior to marriage, that doesn't actually explain marriage timing or change the relationship between employment and marriage. So there are aspects of these jobs that aren't necessarily financial that are very important on the marriage market. For women, having a higher wage in the past does appear to help them marry, and this is the higher wage in the past is likely to be enabling their contributions to their family's savings as well as to the costs of marriage. So there are very different mechanisms and roles for employment comparing men and women. Now, one of our final questions is about queuing and unemployment. So in seeking public sector work, youth may wait in the unemployed state. And using our models, we investigated whether queuing is an effective strategy in the marriage market. So for instance, unemployment can delay marriage, but public sector work accelerates marriage. There's this trade-off. And we are going to show in this moment simulation results that show the trade-off really is going to depend on whether or not you get a public sector job. So the probability of obtaining a public sector job really matters, and that probability has been diminishing over time in the region. And also how long you have to wait, the duration of queuing, how long you have to wait to get a public sector job if you get one. So those are two important factors to keep in mind when we think about the trade-offs in queuing. So I'm just going to show you the queuing results for a couple of countries and a couple of gender combinations here, but I'm happy to answer questions on any other ones you may be interested in. So first, I'm showing queuing for men in Egypt. And here we're looking at the median age at marriage and how it depends on the number of years unemployed, as well as whether or not someone gets a public sector job. So for instance, here in the blue, if they spend 0 years unemployed and they get a public sector job right after they leave school, they'll typically marry at age 29. So they marry faster than if they immediately transition here in the red to an informal private sector job. It's about a year faster that you get married if you get those public sector jobs. And you can actually wait in the unemployed state for a number of years, up to 6 years, until that unemployment really equalizes in terms of the trade-off relative to just going into informal work immediately. Now, this is assuming that after 6 years you get a public sector job, which may still be very unlikely, but there are some potential trade-offs where if you think you're going to get a public sector job or you think there's a reasonable probability, it's worthwhile to queue in the unemployed state in terms of the payoff and accelerating marriage in the marriage market. And we see a somewhat similar result for women in Jordan. The queuing pays off only over a shorter time horizon. So here you can spend no years unemployed, and you'll typically marry at age 21 if you get a public sector job, so it's helping them marry. Whereas if you remain, in this case, out of the labor force, you're typically marrying at age 22. And after 1 year of unemployment, these equalize, and you see longer and longer transitions to marriage the longer you stay unemployed. So there's somewhat different trade-offs in different genders and different contexts in terms of whether queuing might pay off for the marriage market, at least, as well as in the benefits of having a public sector job in other ways. So to conclude, I want to emphasize there's, as we were discussing, considerable public anxiety around particularly delays in marriage, this idea of waithood, and the difficulties in transitioning to these adult roles. And access to employment is really critical in this transition to marriage and adulthood. This work confirms the importance of work, and particularly good work, that public sector work, especially for men, beyond wages or formality, pays off in the marriage market. And work appears to help women save primarily when they, for instance, work in a private informal job, accumulate savings, and then quit to get married. Given the importance of good work, we also see that it may be worthwhile to queue on unemployment while seeking good work. And there are a number of policy implications here. Marriage is relevant to a variety of markets, as Ragi was mentioning earlier. Economists should be very engaged and concerned in some of these issues because, for instance, the shrinking share of public sector, the rising informality are going to affect these transitions. And also, the marriage market itself can affect labor market decisions in the reverse. So, for instance, that entrepreneurship delays marriage relative to formal employment may make it a less appealing alternative, and suggestions that youth all become entrepreneurs as a solution to unemployment are really going to face a barrier in terms of that not being a strategy that pays off in the marriage market either. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of the discussion.